Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm Kenney that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hello, Hydrogen Rising listeners. Thanks for joining us on another exciting episode of Hydrogen Rising. Glad to have all of you back, both in the United States and, of course, around the world. My name is David Walkner. I'm a partner in the global law firm K&L Gates, and I co-lead our hydrogen practice. And joining me in the recording booth today, as always, is my fantastic co-host, Sandy Safro, Associate General Counsel at the Edison Electric Institute. Sandy, we are, I think, officially in spring in Washington, D.C. now.
We certainly are. I think we're in the period of time when you can turn your heat on and your air conditioning on within a 12-hour period.
Yeah, that's totally correct. And I think I did that yesterday. Probably not the most energy efficient way to run things, but had to do it. Sandy, we have talked about over the last year and a half, really, about the exciting developments that governments are taking on hydrogen, and that is both here in the United States as well as internationally. Today, we are really fortunate to have on a public servant from the state of New Mexico. For our international listeners, that is not in the country of Mexico, that is a state in the United States. We have joining us today the New Mexico Secretary of Environment, James Kenney. Secretary Kenney has spent more than 21 years, including across 2 stints at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, most recently having served as Senior Policy Advisor for Oil and Gas, where he worked with senior U.S. EPA leadership designing strategies to support environmentally responsible development of oil and gas resources in the United States. Secretary Kenney, now the Secretary of Environment for the state of New Mexico, has been working very closely with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham on some of the state's exciting developments around hydrogen, and we're very excited to have Secretary Kenney join us today. So, Secretary, thanks for joining us on Hydrogen Rising.
It's a pleasure to be here, David, and thank you for inviting me to you and to Sandy.
Absolutely. We try to keep these to under 30 minutes or so, and I feel like with you on, we could go for quite a bit longer than that, but we're conscious of your time as a public servant. So we're just going to jump right in. I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to level set at the outset here about the state of New Mexico. We do have listeners from more than 25 countries. And so I think it'd be helpful for our listeners if you tell them a bit about the state of New Mexico, its natural resource base, and what are some of the significant environmental issues that the state is facing, either individually or as part of our more kind of global climate efforts, and what are the issues you're dealing with in the Department of the Environment?
Great. Thanks, David. You teed up a really significant question. And let me first start off by saying all your listeners are invited to come to New Mexico, are invited to do business here, are invited to see why we call New Mexico the land of enchantment. To level set, we are the 5th largest state in the United States, but we are a very small population, about 2 million people. So there's ample space here, ample alpine mountains to enjoy, arid desert-like mountains in the southern part of the state. We have this fertile Rio Grande River Valley that flows through the center of the state that creates this amazing habitat for migratory birds, opportunities for hiking trails, opportunities to get out and mountain bike. We're really an interesting state in that in the Southwest, we have to the south of us, we have the country of Mexico. So we share an international border with Mexico, which opens up the door for amazing amount of economic and cultural exchanges in the southern part of the state as well. But across the state, we have 23 federally recognized tribes. So that tribal Native American culture is very pervasive in the state of New Mexico, which is great. And then there's this historic Spanish and Mexico influence in the state as well. And that leads to really great cultural events. It leads to really great food. It leads to really great lifestyle here in New Mexico. But thinking about your question and going into sort of what are some of the areas in which New Mexico has both challenges and opportunities, for that matter, on the environmental front is that, a lot of we're an arid state, so we get very little water, very little rainfall. We have ample brackish water, right below our feet, if you will, but we have very little rainfall and fresh water. So we're very much into conservation and preservation of our freshwater resources. We're very focused on what our climate footprint looks like. As the second largest oil producing state in the country, in the United States, we have significant climate impact and localized air pollution impacts from industries like oil and gas. So from water to air to climate, these are sort of our big ticket items that we're always focused on managing in a sustainable way. And that sort of takes us into our climate efforts, if you will, and really why we're interested in hydrogen as a means to supplement our aggressive stance around renewable energy, such as wind, solar, geothermal. We know that we're not going to get the climate reductions we need to get. Full stop. We're not going to get those climate reductions if we don't move past those renewable resources and start thinking about things. And we're doing more than thinking, actually, about clean hydrogen in New Mexico.
That's really helpful. I would say, just as a personal point, your point about the food and about being the land of enchantment, I can absolutely attest to those as someone who's spent the last 26 years going to New Mexico regularly and now actually a homeowner right along that fertile Rio Grande Valley that you referenced. So really fantastic place. I'm not sure I want everyone coming to New Mexico, but certainly appreciate people taking advantage of the state and what all that it has to offer. So I, because of that personal connection, Secretary Kenney, I do follow New Mexico politics a bit. And I note that your Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, has been a very strong advocate for clean hydrogen and the role that it can play in the state. But my sense is you all have had some challenges in the state legislature advancing initiatives, advancing legislation that would help develop those hydrogen resources. One of the things that stood out to me, I think there was legislation that would have promoted or funded a public-private partnership opportunity for the deployment of hydrogen resources. Can you talk to us a little bit about the legislative process in New Mexico, and particularly what is the skepticism? Why have you guys kind of faced some challenges in moving forward on Governor Lujan Grisham's agenda to promote hydrogen? What has been kind of a sticking points for you guys?
Yeah, great question. And while we're talking about legislation and our focus that we had this past session on hydrogen and creating state law pursuant to that topic, I want to just set the backdrop that we have so many activities going on with respect to building out a clean energy economy, and hydrogen is a piece of that, and our legislative process is yet another piece of that. So I don't want the listeners to think that this was our one shot at doing something on hydrogen. And in fact, we'll probably continue down this legislative path with respect to hydrogen in the future. But what happened this last session was really interesting. We took a bold and aggressive stance that we're not going to leave any emissions on the table, right? So we're going to continue down that path that we have to do everything, all of the above, as soon as possible, because we fully believe that the climate is changing. We fully believe that we have to do something about it. And to that end, we put forward a public-private partnership bill that had production tax credits in it as well for clean hydrogen being produced in New Mexico. We modeled some of the production tax credits after what's happening at the federal level, or what isn't happening maybe at the federal level right now.
That's a better way to say it.
on the production tax credits. We wanted to layer on to what's happening federally so that New Mexico would see the benefit of that increased economic job growth and the decreased climate emissions. So that was the goal of our bill. It was met with resistance in the legislature, and I think there's something that is happening not here, just not happening in New Mexico, but happening nationally, and maybe internationally as well, is that people are not sold that clean hydrogen is in fact clean, that clean hydrogen is in fact going to be a climate solution. And, in order for a state, an official like myself, to be able to say that we're in on that, you have to do a couple of things. You have to make sure your house is in order. And our house is in order in the sense that we have oil and gas regulations that are leading the country in terms of reduction of methane emissions. So once you keep those methane emissions in the pipelines, then you can actually get downstream and say your hydrogen is clean. Now, there are operators who in the oil and gas space who need some investment in order to keep that gas in the pipe, in order for hydrogen to be clean. And we're working on that here in New Mexico. But let's also keep in mind that our legislation was focused on hydrogen being a solution, not being the problem. The problem of leaking methane is separate and apart from the solution of clean hydrogen. And that's how we see it. So we went down the path of working on production tax credits. We went down the path of ensuring that once you produce hydrogen, that you could distribute it. So we had tax incentives for the distribution of hydrogen. And then ultimately, you can't have a production and consumption market unless you have consumers and off-takers of hydrogen. So we looked downstream and we said, how do we incent that industry to grow here in New Mexico, from everything from transportation to hard to decarbonize sectors, industrial sectors. And we put in tax credits and deductions for them to switch from higher carbon fuels to lower carbon fuels. Meaning hydrogen. And then we also created these public-private partnership concepts where we would have put significant amount of money into building out that hydrogen economy by allowing our state financing authority to basically low interest lend or grant that money out to those communities, those industries that wanted to take root here. So we had a very big incentive package that went forward. And what we were met with was concern that there was no regulatory guardrails for the industries that would be making hydrogen. Those in New Mexico tend to be oil and gas, right? That could be a blue hydrogen kind of scenario, but it also could be a green hydrogen kind of scenario where people would come in and use electrolyzers to make hydrogen. And, those criticisms were heard, and we're thinking about how to bring such a bill back. But I also want to say, to my earlier point, unless you're willing to do the work as a state to put that foundation in. So our foundation is we have our Energy Transition Act, which says we're on a trajectory to have zero carbon electric generation. Our biggest industry, our largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions is oil and gas. We have nationally leading rules there. So we've done the work to set the stage for hydrogen to be a solution where electrification can't, through renewables can't get to those industries.
That's a really helpful response. And I love your description of kind of separating the challenges associated with methane emissions from the potential solution that hydrogen could offer, maybe thinking about those in parallel paths instead of in conjunction all the time. I want to pivot a little bit, and I think your point on efforts beyond legislation created a little bit of an opening for me to ask this question. We were really interested to see the announcement about the memorandum of understanding that was signed by your Environment Department, the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, and the state's two national laboratories, which are Los Alamos and Sandia, for folks who are not familiar. Can you tell us a little bit more about the memorandum of understanding, how the agencies and the labs are going to be working together to advance hydrogen, and other things that might be of interest to our listeners?
Yeah, that's great. We have a number of activities happening outside of the legislative process, and that being one of our hallmarks. And for the listeners, I don't know if people know this, but DOE, as you point out, Sandy, has two national labs here. I think we're the only state in the country that has two national labs. Point of pride here in New Mexico that we have both of those, and we're engaged with both of them now in this hydrogen relationship under the MOU. That effort is really focusing in on how do we look at the natural resources that in New Mexico, how do we look at the economy of New Mexico, and how do we build out policies that will allow us to adopt zero carbon hydrogen across the state? So let me land it a little bit more than being so theoretical. So with our two national labs and those three agencies you mentioned, energy, environment, and economic development, it's really important for us that we build technology and policy solutions that don't just live in laboratories, that aren't just theoretical, that actually can be applied, that build capacity within the state of New Mexico such that industry can come in and use those solutions. We want that technology transfer to happen. We want it to happen rapidly. Again, because we have a backdrop of a significant climate challenge. We're in a decisive decade. We have to get these technologies rolled out. That's what the MOU is kind of focusing on. So things now to the granular, things like pore space for carbon capture sequestration, and what fields are best used for carbon capture sequestration in New Mexico. How would we do geologic storage of large-scale hydrogen production? How do we ensure a fair and safe transition of our workforce from other industries into a hydrogen industry? So that's part of it. So everything that a state would need, this state would need to go from a theoretical hydrogen economy to an actual hydrogen economy is in the realm of that MOU with our national labs. And what better partners to have? There's no better partner to have than the national laboratories.
That's great. And I think I'm really heartened to hear a description that involves multiple clean energy technologies integrated in a way that provides kind of a whole cloth type of approach. And we certainly are in the realm of moving beyond the theoretical into the applied. And so my next question is going to be maybe a little bit even more towards that point. I wanted to note another exciting development for our listeners, which is a multi-state agreement that your governor signed with Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. And as I understand it, it is intended to create a teaming approach to bid into what is potentially becoming the hottest word in the hydrogen industry in the United States, which is the DOE Hydrogen Hub Grant Program. So can you tell us a little bit more about this initiative, what the objectives are, the process, whether there will be private sector input, things like that?
Yeah, I agree, Sandy. Hub is all the rage in the States for sure. But let me start off by saying that Governor Lujan Grisham is not afraid of big, bold agendas, and hydrogen being one of those agendas. And when we saw the Hydrogen Hub announcement in the Biden infrastructure law, we knew that our economy and our environment, which can both be furthered and sustained, this would be a big benefit for the state of New Mexico to pursue this funding. So we thought long and hard about it from a multi-cabinet perspective, and then we had other states reaching out to us saying, New Mexico's leadership on hydrogen is so strong and pronounced that we want to partner with you. And we started working with those three other states you mentioned, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, to think about what a partnership would mean for the $8 billion in the Biden infrastructure law to stand up regional hydrogen hubs. And we found value in that partnership across the states. One of the primary reasons we see value in that is that the hydrogen economy is going to be something that is broader than any one geographic location. It's going to be broader than a singular state, and it's not going to, fortunately, respect state boundaries, right? And that's a good thing here. So we saw benefit in joining in with these other states in pursuit of that funding so that we could learn a little bit from those states. Like Wyoming has what we call in the states the Class 6 carbon capture sequestration program. New Mexico does not. So if we want to learn from them about how that program was stood up and how they're running it, we can do that. if another state wants to learn from us on how we're using clean hydrogen and ensuring that it comes from responsibly sourced gas, we're happy to explain to them how that works. So we have those kinds of business relationships that we're learning from each other. But in addition to that, we share a lot. We are all states with rural populations, with urban centers, with mountains, with deserts, with low rainfall. So we have commonalities as well that naturally group us together, thinking about the challenges of hydrogen production, storage, pipelines, distribution, consumption, etc. So we're off and running on that partnership, and we're meeting weekly. I'll note for the other listeners in other states that New Mexico, that this Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub group was the first one in the US to form. And we've been working diligently every week on furthering both our RFP, which was already submitted, and then thinking about and putting together the information we want to put forward when DOE does request the proposals.
And that is so exciting. By the way, I think the acronym of that is WISH, correct?
It is WISH.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, you're putting it out there. I will say, I mean, Sandy and I both have had a lot of intersection with a number of the hub projects that are being contemplated, and it feels like it's going to be a big smackdown. The rumble, right? That everyone's going to get in and try to get a piece of this. So incredibly exciting. I also, the last point that struck me, Secretary Kenney, is that you said, the hydrogen economy isn't going to respect borders, and that's a good thing. I'd also note that you have bipartisan leadership across those 4 states, right? It's not 4 Democratic states or 4 Republican states. It is states that have mixed leadership. And that, to me, is one of the most important pieces of this puzzle, is the recognition across the political spectrum that hydrogen can play a critical part of our clean climate future if done the right way, right? To advance the clean hydrogen economy. So I really appreciate that. Maybe in closing here, you mentioned in kind of your opening remarks today, the need, as you were going through the legislative process, the need for education. And so I'd like to just kind of dwell on that a little bit, and particularly given the role of the Environment Department in advancing the state's climate objectives. There is a debate, and I know you're aware of it, having spent years, working for the responsible development of oil and gas resources, this debate that, yes, hydrogen is an emissions-free combustion fuel source, and yes, it can be a carrier of renewable energy, but the detractors, the opponents, and we are starting to see some reports come out that say, kind of a bit flippantly, I would suggest that, it's just a lifeline for oil and gas companies, for example, or how are we really going to know if the hydrogen is clean hydrogen? I guess my question to you is, how do we manage this debate? How do we help educate? How can we kind of chart that path that allows us to move forward with clean hydrogen as a zero emission fuel source, combustion source, helps us advance renewable power, but also remain committed to our climate goals? How do we do that? How do you see the department having a role in that?
Yeah, David, it's such a great question and such an important one. And it's multifaceted as well, right? Because let's take a step back for a second and just recognize that the federal government is an important sort of big picture funder, thinker about hydrogen. But the reality is states are the incubators of the outcome, right? And at the most local level, you're talking to fence line communities, you're talking to indigenous populations, you're talking to people who have genuine concern about their health, about their environment. And you have to think that through in terms of how you're communicating. And I think you can't underestimate that, nor can you talk, as an engineer, I can't sit there and talk in engineering speak, right? You have to connect with people where they are. And that's, I think, where the whole hydrogen economy needs to take a step back. Everybody who's involved and think about, how am I communicating with my neighbors? How am I explaining this to people. That's something that we've learned, and that's something that we're continuing to do here in New Mexico. We can't be so bureaucratic in states that we say we're your permitting authority and not have the conversations about, what does this mean? What do these facilities look like, sound like? What can I expect when I see it? How will I know it's in compliance? How will I know it's, what's my verification method? And these are real great questions, significant challenges for states to resolve. But we're going down that path. And I'll just can I highlight a couple of things for you?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So we just finalized our oil and gas rules that I think we're the first state in the country that instead of prescribing a flare to control emissions, which are bright, which are dirty, which are loud, which don't always work, we said an acceptable air pollution control device is a fuel cell. So you can now, under state law, use a fuel cell instead of a flare. Nobody had problems with that. Not one public comment challenging the elimination of flares and the incentive to use fuel cells. Fuel cells convert hydrogen, right, methane, hydrogen molecules to electricity. I think that's one thing we did in New Mexico that I think will help with the social adoption of hydrogen when people start understanding the technology. The other thing that I think is important is that people need to see demonstration projects. They need to see in their communities. I know a lot of folks, when I was in high school, I drove a forklift. I changed propane tanks. I smelled it. It was horrible. When you go to a Costco or a Walmart or somewhere like that now, and they're stocking the shelves and bringing out these carts that move, these pallet movers, those are running on fuel cells. Like fuel cells are in people's neighborhood. Hydrogen is being used in people's neighborhood, but people don't recognize that. They don't know it. So I think helping people understand what it looks like, what it doesn't have, I want to say what it smells like and what it sounds like, but neither of those would come true. But helping people understand that it's in their everyday life, and then having the integrity and validation process to assure that the fuel is as carbon neutral as possible. And that's where I go back to, you have to be bold in your leadership around not only setting important rules in place like we did for oil and gas, but you actually have to enforce them. You can't rely on voluntary compliance with rules. You have to actually enforce those rules. And that gives integrity to the system when you can say, I've been to 100 well pads and 3 of them were leaking. That means 97 were compliant. That helps you in the narrative. There's no silver bullet here. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think states are going to be the ones who need to socialize it because we're the ones that deal with communities the most.
Well, that's, I think, an incredibly thoughtful and insightful response, and recognizing that important role that states play, I think is key. My sense, too, is that the Department of Energy understands that as they are moving forward on some of these grant programs and is looking for states to be active in this. So really exciting stuff. Secretary Kenney, we have really enjoyed having you on Hydrogen Rising today. I expect that, maybe in 6 months' time, when you guys probably have even more announcements. I know we didn't even touch today on the announcement with Universal Hydrogen, for example, which the aviation company, which has decided to site operations in New Mexico, which is incredibly exciting. But there's a lot more I think we can probably talk about in the future. So thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, David, thank you. And I have just one question for you.
Yeah.
Red, green, or Christmas?
So I'm a green guy. I'm definitely a green guy. And I will tell you, we here in Washington, the New Mexico State Society every year brings in, thousands of pounds of green chili. And I buy them every single year, and I roast them and stick them in the freezer, and I eat fresh green chilies all year long here in Washington, D.C. So definitely a green guy. How about
can't
you?
Wrap up without you explaining that.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, Secretary Kenney. We'll take another 2 minutes. You want to just tell our listeners what that question was about?
Yeah, so for your listeners, if you come to New Mexico, you'll be faced with the same question, red, green, or Christmas. And we're significant and probably the world's best chili producers here in New Mexico. We harvest green Hatch chilies out of Hatch, New Mexico. And then occasionally, or not occasionally, then we also let them ripen to be red chilies. Those are roasted, served all year long with great food here in New Mexico. And you'll get the question when you go to a restaurant, red for red chili, green for green chili, or Christmas if you'd like both.
Yep. And I would encourage everyone, if you ever get a chance, try those Hatch New Mexico green chilies. They're really, really delicious. Well, thanks, Secretary Kenney. Really enjoyed the conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of our Hydrogen Rising listeners for joining in again today. We will be back in another couple of weeks with the next installment of Hydrogen Rising.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.